What does it mean when General Langley points the finger at President Traoré? When a black man in Washington accuses a black man in Wagadugu of betrayal, who is really betraying whom? This is not just a clash of nations. It's a war over who gets to define dignity. In this story, Traoré doesn't just defend himself. He becomes the voice of a new Africa, and the world can no longer look away. The Senate Armed Services Committee chamber in Washington, D.C., gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights, its polished mahogany desks curved like a tribunal awaiting a verdict. Cameras hummed, pens scratched on notepads, and the air was thick with expectation. In the witness seat sat General Michael Langley, the first black four-star general to command U.S. military operations in Africa. His uniform was crisp, his shoulders heavy with stars, but his words would soon carry a weight no insignia could bear. "I must inform the committee," Langley began, his voice steady, almost mechanical, "that the current leadership in Burkina Faso is diverting national gold reserves to fund foreign mercenary forces aligned with the Russian Federation." The room froze. The word gold had a way of silencing even the most restless senators. Langley pressed on, claiming that Captain Ibrahim Traoré's regime was siphoning wealth meant for public welfare to pay for Russian-affiliated mercenaries operating in the Sahel. It was a statement designed not for debate, but for headlines. And headlines it got. By evening, news networks erupted. Burkina Faso's gold fuels Russian mercenaries, AFRICOM chief warrants. U.S. sounds alarm on Traoré's Moscow ties. Is Wagadugu becoming Russia's puppet? Across the Atlantic, in European newsrooms and African talk shows, a story took shape. A rogue African leader trading his nation's future for foreign muscle. To some, it felt like a recycled script. To others, it felt like a setup. But in Wagadugu, the ground held still. For now. That night, asoral, as social media churned with Langley's stern face and cherry-picked quotes, a quieter clip gained traction, raw, unpolished, straight from the chamber. When Senator Hargrove from Ohio pressed Langley, the general hesitated. "Do you have evidence of these transactions?" Hargrove asked, leaning forward. Langley's pause was brief, but telling. "We have credible indicators," he said. "No documents, no specifics, just indicators." For Washington, it was enough. For Wall Street, it rattled markets. For Africa, it was a slap. In Wagadugu, the news didn't arrive through diplomatic channels, but via a text from a journalist in Accra. The irony wasn't lost on the small circle gathered in the presidential palace. Nor was the timing. Traoré was days away from a trip to Moscow for a high-profile international summit. In a dimly lit hallway, the president's communications advisor, a sharp-eyed former professor named Malik, stared at the transcript. "They're framing the visit before he even steps on the plane," he muttered to a colleague. Inside the president's office, Captain Ibrahim Traoré set his tablet down with deliberate calm. He said nothing at first, just stood and walked to the window. Beyond the courtyard, the national flag rippled in the warm evening breeze. The sky was clear, but the horizon felt heavy. His aide, a reserved former lieutenant named Samuel, broke the silence. "They're expecting you to stay quiet, sir." Traoré nodded, his eyes still on the flag. "They're counting on it." Outside, Wagadugu hummed with life. Street vendors lit their lamps, children darted through dusty alleys, and radios crackled with music. But something else stirred, faint but growing like a spark in dry grass. Not everyone had heard Langley's words yet, but those who didn't ask if they were true. They asked why now? Why him? In a small cafe near the university, a young literature professor named Aisha turned off her phone's news app and said to her friend, "The ugliest lies come from men in suits, and the cruelest come from men who look like us." In a Lagos radio studio, a host leaned into his microphone and said, "General Langley wore a uniform today, but he read someone else's lines." Who's holding the pen? The next morning, before the sun breached the horizon, Traoré called for a press conference. No diplomats, no delays, just a camera, a microphone, and the truth. He wasn't going to let Africa be spoken for. He would speak first. It wasn't just a response. It was the beginning of something bigger. The press hall in the presidential compound was simple, built for function, not fanfare. The walls were bare except for a national flag, slightly tilted by the hum of a ceiling fan. The air was warm, the silence heavy. The camera rolled for exactly 12 seconds before Traoré spoke. He sat in a wooden chair, its high back unadorned, his posture straight but not rigid. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, looked directly into the lens, his gaze steady, as if challenging it to look away. "This," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "is the gold of Burkina Faso. Not mine, not theirs." A British journalist, seated a few feet away, shifted but didn't interrupt. Traoré leaned forward just enough to draw the room in. "Let's be clear about history," he continued. "Before my administration, this nation had no gold reserves. Not a single ounce was held in our name. It was taken, shipped abroad, accounted for in foreign ledgers. We changed that. We brought our wealth home, stored it in our vaults, under our skies." His words were calm, but landed like stone. "And now they claim we're using that gold to hire mercenaries. Tell me, since when is defending our nation a crime? Since when does sovereignty need a permission slip?" He paused, exhaling once, his eyes flicking off camera for a moment. When he looked back, his tone sharpened. They didn't send a reporter. They didn't send an ambassador. They sent a soldier, a black soldier, to accuse a black man of betraying his people. That's not strategy. That's betrayal dressed in stars and stripes. The room held its breath. The journalist found his voice. "Do you believe General Langley meant what he said?" Traoré's response was measured but piercing. "If he was misled, he owes it to the world to say so, not in backrooms, not in whispers, but in the same chamber where he spoke. But if he lied, if he stood there and wove fiction into fact, then he must answer. Not to me, not to this government, but to every African child who sees a uniform and dreams of integrity. To every young person who thought our time had finally come." He leaned back, his face calm, but his eyes alight with something unyielding. "The shame isn't in being accused," he said. "The shame is in staying silent when truth is choked." The interview ended abruptly. No pleasantries, no fade-out. Just Traoré's gaze lingering as the screen cut to black. By nightfall, the clip was everywhere, shared, translated, woven into social media posts and street conversations. It wasn't just his voice anymore. It was the continent's. In a market square in Wagadugu, someone scrawled his words on a wall. If he lied, he must answer. Across WhatsApp groups and YouTube comments, a quiet call emerged. If Traoré speaks for Africa's future, amplify his voice. Wagadugu didn't sleep that night, nor the night after. The city pulsed with a restless energy, as if the air itself carried the weight of Traoré's words. By the third day, 72 hours since General Langley's testimony in Washington and President Traoré's piercing response, the streets of Burkina Faso found their voice. In the early morning haze, a teenage boy named Kwame stood before a cracked concrete wall in a busy market square. He clutched a can of red paint, his hands steady despite the crowd gathering behind him. With slow, deliberate strokes, he wrote a single word, "Traitor." Below it, he stenciled the unmistakable profile of General Langley, his jaw sharp, his stars glinting. The image was crude, but unmistakable. By midday, Langley's face appeared elsewhere, on alley walls in Tankadogo, on shop shutters in Bobo Dioulasso, on the dusty rear windows of taxis weaving through Ouagadougou's chaotic traffic. Always with the same word, traitor. The message wasn't polished, but it was raw, visceral, and spreading like wildfire. In the capital's central plaza, where the parliament's dome loomed above sprawling baobab trees, a crowd began to gather. First dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. By the time a drone camera buzzed overhead, the square was a sea of bodies, shoulder to shoulder, banners raised, voices rising in the scorching sun. Some wore shirts with Traoré's face, his steady gaze printed in bold colors. Others held cardboard signs scrawled with defiance. Our gold, our rules. A general without a people is a puppet. Africa answers for itself. At the heart of the crowd stood a young woman named Fatou, a university student with a quiet intensity. She was the daughter of cotton farmers, her life shaped by the red earth of Burkina Faso and the stories of a nation long spoken for by others. She hadn't planned to speak, but when a megaphone was thrust into her hands and the chants around her softened, she stepped onto a wooden crate and faced the crowd. My mother never learned to write. Fatou began, her voice catching once before steadying. But she knows the smell of stolen wealth. She knows the look of betrayal. The crowd murmured, a low ripple of agreement. When that man stood in their Senate and called us thieves of our own gold, he wasn't telling the truth. He was echoing their fear of a nation standing tall. She pointed toward the Ministry of Communications, its antennas glinting behind coils of barbed wire. They may own the airwaves, but we own the streets. The cheer that followed wasn't explosive but deep, resonant, like the rumble of thunder beneath the earth. Across Wagadugu, journalists perched on rooftops, broadcasting live. Western outlets labeled it a protest. Local reporters called it a reckoning. In the comments of a live stream from Accra, someone wrote, "This isn't a march. It's a memory taking back its name." Fatou raised her hand, holding a crumpled photo of Langley mid-speech, pulled from a cheap printer. Someone had scrawled "traitor" across his forehead in black ink. She held it high, not with anger, but with clarity. "This is what happens when we let others write our story," she said. "No more." The crowd answered, voices blending into a chant. "Not your gold, not your truth, not your chains." In the northern city of Djibo, a teacher played Traoré's interview through a school's loudspeakers. If he lied, he must answer. In Wagadugu, the mayor canceled a routine press conference and joined the crowd in the town square, standing silently among his people. In the south, in Banfora, children climbed onto rooftops, flying kites made of scrap paper, each bearing 3 words, "Dignity is ours." By evening, global news networks could no longer ignore the story. CNN ran a segment titled "Burkina Faso's Defiant Response." BBC hosted a rushed panel where a retired British diplomat admitted, "We may have misjudged this young leader." A journalist from Senegal countered, "You didn't misjudge Traoré. You misjudged his people." In Ouagadougou's plaza, as the sun dipped low and the chants softened into songs, a barefoot boy dragged a flag across the square. It was too large for him, its edges fraying, but he tied it to a lamppost beneath a statue of a long-ago revolutionary. He whispered, almost to himself, "We're not selling gold. We're claiming dignity." The images from Burkina Faso crossed borders, not as news, but as a mirror held up to a continent and its diaspora. Not everyone liked the reflection. In a cramped studio in Nairobi, a journalist named Beatrice sat under bright lights, her face composed but her eyes sharp with purpose. She hosted Echoes of Truth, a Pan-African podcast streamed in English and Swahili, known for cutting through noise with clarity. Beatrice had watched Langley's testimony repeatedly, not for his words. She'd memorized those, but for the moments his face betrayed his voice. The slight tightening of his jaw, the flicker of his gaze. She was looking for the man behind the uniform. Her producer signaled, "Live in 10." Beatrice nodded, took a breath, and when the light turned green, she came alive. "Good evening, brothers and sisters," she said, her voice warm but edged with steel. "Tonight, we're not talking about Washington's games or Moscow's promises. We're talking about mirrors." She clicked a remote, and 2 images appeared on the screen behind her. Langley in his Senate seat, stars gleaming, and a younger Langley, decades earlier in a faded college photo, grinning in a Morehouse sweatshirt, his eyes bright with promise. "What happened here?" Beatrice asked, pointing to the young man. "And here." Her finger tapped the general's polished insignia. "When did the son of a black teacher become the mouthpiece for empire?" She played Traoré's interview clip, pausing at his words. "That's betrayal dressed in stars and stripes." "This isn't about gold," she said. "It's about a betrayal wrapped in our skin and spoken in our language. The live chat exploded. She's speaking truth. Langley's not the first to sell out. Keep going. Beatrice leaned forward. Let's be real, she said. The West has always painted Africa's leaders as villains. Unstable, corrupt, dangerous. They fed us that image, and we've swallowed it too long. She clicked again, showing clips from old Hollywood films. African warlords, mercenaries, chaos. They taught us to fear our own strength, she said softly, to doubt our own reflection. Then she played a lesser-known clip, a 2018 Pentagon briefing where Langley discussed securing mineral zones in Africa. She muted it and looked into the camera. They've always needed someone who looks like us to speak for them, she said. Because when the oppressor wears your face, the resistance hesitates. Behind her, headlines flashed. African youth rally behind Traoré. Outrage grows over U.S. Generals' claims. Diaspora debates, loyalty, and truth. Beatrice exhaled. We have to stop thinking every black face stands for black freedom, she said. Some are just uniforms. Some are masks. She showed a post from a Nigerian activist. Langley didn't betray us. He forgot who we are. The screen went dark for a moment. Then her voice softened. I don't hate the general, she said. I grieve for him. They gave him stars to hide the chains. She removed her earpiece, and the silence lingered. Her producer whispered, That's going viral. By midnight it had. By morning, Beatrice's words were quoted on walls in Kampala, Dakar, and even Chicago's South Side, stenciled beside Traoré's. They gave him stars to hide the chains. In Brooklyn, someone spray-painted it over a mural of Martin Luther King Jr., the words curling like a question mark. Back in Wagadugu, the energy hadn't faded. The crowds grew, not in chaos, but in purpose. Traoré hadn't spoken again. Not yet, but his silence felt deliberate, giving space for the people to claim the narrative. In a small village outside the capital, an elder named Musa gathered his neighbors under a mango tree. He played Traoré's interview on a cracked smartphone. The signal weak, but the message clear. This man, Musa said, is not fighting for himself. He's fighting for us to remember who we are. In Washington, Langley remained silent. No statement, no clarification, not even a leaked comment from an aide. The Pentagon issued a vague press release about monitoring developments, but it felt hollow, like a bureaucracy dodging accountability. The silence wasn't ignorance. It was strategy, and it only fueled the fire. On social media, hashtags multiplied. Traoré speaks, Langley answer, Africa rising. A Ghanaian artist posted a cartoon of Langley polishing his stars while Traoré held a mirror, captioned, Look before you speak. The American audience, watching from living rooms and office screens, was divided. For some, Langley's testimony rang true, a warning about Russian influence, a call to protect global stability. They saw Traoré as a wild card, a leader cozying up to Moscow, threatening the order they trusted. But others, especially those who'd grown skeptical of Washington's motives, saw something else, a black general being used to smear a black leader, a familiar tactic dressed in new rhetoric. In barbershops and church groups, conversations turned to trust, power, and who gets to tell the truth. Langley's one of us, a retired teacher in Atlanta said, but he's playing their game. A veteran in Cleveland countered, Traoré's not a saint, but he's calling out the script. In Wagadugu, the question wasn't about Langley's motives, but about what came next. Traoré's Moscow trip loomed, a moment that could either amplify his defiance or invite more scrutiny. The streets buzzed with anticipation, not just for his words, but for the world's reaction. Would Langley respond? Would Washington double down? Or would the silence stretch on, a tacit admission of defeat? As the sun set over the Capitol, a young poet stood in the plaza, reciting to a small crowd. Our gold is not for sale. Our truth is not for hire. Our dignity is not a chain. The words echoed, carried by the wind, ready to meet the world stage. The sky above Moscow's Red Square was a flawless blue, unmarred by clouds, a rare spring day that felt more like a statement than a season. Sunlight glinted off the Kremlin's golden domes, flashed across rows of military medals, and cast sharp shadows on the cobblestones. It was a day of commemoration, a grand Russian ceremony marking a historic victory, but this year, the world's eyes weren't on the usual figures. Among the dark coats and polished uniforms stood a different silhouette, one that drew every camera's focus. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, stood beside Russia's leader, his uniform simpler, his presence undeniable. He didn't smile or wave. His hands were clasped, his gaze steady, as if he carried the weight of a continent on his shoulders. The ceremony was steeped in tradition, anthems, speeches, the slow march of soldiers. But Traoré's presence shifted its meaning. He wasn't here for spectacle. He was here to be seen, to speak, to redefine the narrative that had been written for him in Washington. When the formalities ended, Russia's president stepped aside, gesturing to the podium. It wasn't scripted, but it was deliberate. The world was watching, and Traoré knew it. He stepped forward, alone, no notes, no teleprompter, just a man and a microphone under an endless sky. "We were told we could not govern ourselves," Traoré began, his voice calm but resonant, carrying over the crowd of dignitaries, soldiers, and journalists. The Russian interpreter stood ready, but the words needed no translation to land. "We were told freedom was too heavy a crown for our heads." He paused, letting the silence settle. "But we wore it anyway." The crowd was still, the only sound the faint rustle of flags in the spring breeze. Traoré's eyes swept the square, taking in heads of state, veterans, and a lone U.S. diplomat seated inconspicuously in the back. "In Africa, we do not forget," he continued. "Not the borders drawn without our consent, not the leaders silenced without justice, not the wealth taken without remorse." He didn't name General Langley. He didn't need to. The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. "In this century," Traoré said, his voice steady, "we do not beg for permission to exist. We do not apply for dignity. We claim it." Behind him, the Kremlin's towers stood cold and imposing, but his words warmed the square. "Our partnership with Russia is not one of submission. It is one of mutual respect, on education, on security, on sovereignty." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of surprise and recognition. A journalist lowered her camera, as if to listen more closely. Traoré's voice dropped, not in weakness, but in intimacy, as if speaking to every individual present. "Freedom is not given," he said. "It is taken." The wind swept through, stirring papers and ribbons. A veteran from Ethiopia in the crowd bowed his head, his eyes glistening. Inside Traoré's mind, memories flickered, grueling desert training, the weight of a rifle at dawn, comrades lost to battles no flag could honor. He had once thought leadership meant obedience. Now he knew it meant defiance. The applause came slowly at first, tentative, then growing, until it filled the square. Not for the man, but for the moment, a crack in the old script of power. As Traoré stepped down, a French journalist approached, her notebook open. "That was bold," she said in halting English. "That was honest," Traoré replied, his gaze unwavering. That night, Russian state television replayed the speech, but it was the raw, unedited feed that exploded across African networks. No commentary, no slogans, just truth spoken with consequence. In Bamako, a university professor paused her lecture to stream the speech, her students whispering as they watched. In Accra, teenagers painted Traoré's words on a community center wall. "Freedom is not given. It is taken." In Washington, D.C., a barista in a DuPont Circle cafe overheard customers debating the speech over their laptops. "He's playing with fire," one said, scrolling through a news app. "No," another replied, "he's lighting one." Across the African diaspora, from London to Atlanta, the speech became more than words. It became a call. In Oakland, a poet reworked an old Langston Hughes line, sharing on social media. "Let Africa be what it was always meant to be." For Traoré, this wasn't a triumph, but a pivot. He He was no longer just a soldier or a president. He was a symbol, and symbols carry burdens. The plane that carried him back to Wagadugu landed quietly. No fanfare, just the hum of engines and the heat of the tarmac. Traoré descended the steps, his coat draped over one arm, his aides trailing behind. He nodded once to the soldiers standing guard, then walked to the waiting convoy in silence. The Moscow speech had gone viral, embedded in the pulse of something deeper than news. It was quoted in sermons, painted on walls, sung in street anthems. But the question lingered. Would General Langley respond? Langley hadn't spoken. Not a statement, not a clarification, not even a whisper through Pentagon channels. The silence was deafening, and it wasn't accidental. It felt crafted, a refusal to engage that only deepened the wound. In Washington, the Pentagon issued another vague memo, this time about strategic partnerships in the Sahel, but it was background noise, ignored by those who mattered. On social media, the hashtags grew louder. Traoré speaks, Langley answer, Africa rising. A Kenyan cartoonist shared an image of Traoré at the podium, a lion at his back, while Langley sat in shadows, his stars dimmed. The caption read, Truth roars. Silence hides. In Wagadugu, the streets hadn't cooled. The crowd from the previous days hadn't dispersed. They'd grown, their purpose sharpening. Traoré's return wasn't marked by a parade, but by a quiet anticipation. Reporters gathered at the presidential palace, expecting a press conference, a follow-up to Moscow. Instead, they received a single-sheet invitation, one seat per outlet, no questions, just a message. That evening, as the sun sank behind Wagadugu's low rooftops, Traoré walked alone onto a modest wooden stage in the palace courtyard. No flags, no guards, just a microphone and a sky turning amber. He looked into the single camera, his face framed by the fading light. My name is not a threat, he began, his voice soft but unyielding. It is a mirror. The words landed like a stone in still water. I was born in a land where maps were drawn by strangers and redrawn in blood. I grew up in a world where my skin meant suspicion, my silence meant survival. He paused, letting the truth breathe. But I'm silent no more. The camera held him in focus, no graphics, no distractions. I went to Moscow not to seek approval, not to provoke, but to speak, he said. Because when a black man stands tall, another is always sent to cut him down. The reference to Langley was clear, though unspoken. The general may never respond. That is his choice, but it is also his weight to carry. Traoré's hand stayed at his sides, his posture still. This is no longer about one man in a foreign uniform. It is about the systems that forge those uniforms, that polish black skin until it forgets what it was meant to protect. His voice deepened, not louder but heavier. I do not hate the man who stood before the Senate and spoke what he was told. I mourn for him. He was taught that proximity to power is power itself, that to serve his nation, he must erase his people. Traoré stepped forward just once, closing the distance to the lens. To the young black soldier watching this from a base in Virginia, I say, you do not need to become the enemy to earn honor. To the diplomat in New York who swallows insults to keep her seat, I say, you do not need to kneel to stand. To every black man and woman taught that the only path is to follow, look again. The path is already behind you. He turned slightly, his eyes catching a small mirror placed on the stage. Not for theatrics, but for truth. This skin, he said, touching his cheek, is not a tool to be sold. It is history. It is legacy. It is promise. His voice dropped, quiet but razor sharp. If you see a black man in power and choose to attack him for another's applause, look in that mirror and tell me who is still bound. The broadcast ended without ceremony, the screen fading to black. But the words didn't stop. They spread, faster than the Moscow speech, carried by radio waves, social media, and whispered conversations. In Wagadugu, a grandmother listening on her radio wiped her eyes and said, "He's speaking for my grandchildren." In Harlem, a community organizer played the clip at a town hall, pausing to ask, "Who's writing our story?" In Johannesburg, A DJ sampled Traoré's words into a beat, the refrain looping. Look in the mirror. The American audience, glued to their screens, grappled with the weight of it all. For some, Traoré was a provocateur, aligning with Russia to destabilize the West. They trusted Langley's warning, seeing it as a defense of global order. But others saw a deeper truth. A black general used as a weapon against a black leader, a tactic as old as empire. In Chicago's Bronzeville, a pastor preached about mirrors, saying, Langley's stars don't shine for us. In Houston, a veteran posted online, Traoré's not perfect, but he's asking the right questions. The divide wasn't just political. It was personal, a reckoning with trust and identity. In Wagadugu, the question wasn't about Moscow or Washington, but about what came next. Traoré's words had lit a fire, but fires need tending. The streets hummed with purpose, the crowds waiting for the world's response. Would Langley break his silence? Would Washington escalate? Or would the mirror Traoré held up force a reckoning no one could ignore? As night fell, a young girl in the capital tied a ribbon to a fence, its colors those of Burkina Faso's flag. She whispered, "This is our time." The sun rose over Wagadugu, casting long shadows across the city's dusty streets. The air was thick with the scent of earth and anticipation, as if the capital itself was holding its breath. Ibrahim Traoré's words, first from the press hall, then from Moscow, and finally from the palace courtyard, had become more than speeches. They were a pulse, beating through Burkina Faso and beyond, carried by voices in markets, songs in villages, and murals on city walls. The question that had hung over the nation for weeks remained unanswered. Would General Langley respond? His silence, once a strategy, had become a burden, heavy and inescapable. In the presidential palace, Traoré sat at a simple wooden desk, a map of Burkina Faso pinned to the wall behind him. His aide, Samuel, entered quietly, holding a tablet. "The world is still talking, sir," he said. "From Addis Ababa to Los Angeles, they're quoting you." Traoré nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's not about what they say," he replied. "It's about what they do next." Outside, the city buzzed, not with chaos but with purpose. The crowds that had filled the plaza days earlier hadn't vanished. They'd spread, their energy seeping into every corner of the nation. Across the Atlantic, Washington, D.C., was quieter, but the tension was palpable. General Langley had returned to his office at the Pentagon, his schedule filled with meetings, but his name was everywhere. On news tickers, social media threads, and whispered debates in congressional hallways. The Pentagon's press office issued another statement, this one about ongoing assessments in the Sahel, but it was met with shrugs. The world wasn't waiting for bureaucracy. It was waiting for Langley, and Langley wasn't speaking. In a small apartment in Silver Spring, Maryland, a retired journalist named Clara watched the latest clips from Wagadugu. She'd covered Africa for decades, her notebooks filled with stories of leaders rising and falling. Traoré's speeches reminded her of another time, another voice, but what struck her was the response, not just in Burkina Faso, but in her own country. In barbershops in Baltimore, in church basements in Detroit, Americans were talking about mirrors, about betrayal, about who gets to define truth. Langley's one of ours, a friend had said over coffee, but he's carrying someone else's water. Clara opened her laptop and began to write, her first article in years, The General's Silence and the President's Mirror. Back in Wagadugu, the streets were alive with creation. Artists painted Traoré's words on school walls. This skin is history, legacy, promise. Musicians wove his speeches into rhythms. Their songs played on radios from Wagadugu to Banfora. In a dusty village outside the capital, an elder named Musa gathered children under a baobab tree, holding up a photo of Traoré. "This man," he said, "is teaching us to look at ourselves and see strength." The children nodded, their eyes wide, as they traced the word dignity in the dirt with sticks. The global reaction was no less intense. In Lagos, a tech entrepreneur launched an app called Mirror, where users could share stories of reclaiming their narrative. In Paris, a Senegalese poet published a collection titled Not Your Chains, dedicating it to Traoré. In Harlem, a mural appeared on a brick wall, depicting Traoré holding a mirror, with Langley's silhouette fading into the background. Beneath it, in bold letters, "Look again." The diaspora wasn't just watching, it was acting, building, redefining. Yet the American audience remained split. For some, Traoré was a dangerous figure, his Moscow speech a reckless alignment with a rival power. They clung to Langley's testimony, seeing it as a necessary warning against Russian influence. "He's destabilizing the region," a pundit argued on a cable news panel, his voice sharp. But others saw through the rhetoric. In Atlanta, a community organizer named Marcus hosted a podcast, Truth on Trial, where he dissected Langley's silence. He didn't just accuse Traoré, Marcus said, his voice steady. He accused a people, and now he's got nothing to say. Listeners flooded the comments. Langley's stars don't shine for us. Traoré's asking questions we're too scared to. In Wagadugu, Traoré knew the world was waiting for his next move. He'd sparked a fire, but fires could burn out or burn too bright. He called a meeting with his inner circle, Malik, his communications advisor, Samuel, his aide, and Aisha, the young professor whose cafe conversations had turned into speeches at rallies. They gathered in a modest room, the windows open to let in the evening breeze. "The people are with us," Malik said, showing a tablet with trending hashtags. "But the world is watching for a misstep." Traoré leaned back, his fingers steepled. "This isn't about perfection," he said. "It's about truth. They want us to react, to stumble. We won't. We'll build." He outlined a plan, not for more speeches, but for action. Schools would teach the history of Burkina Faso's gold, from colonial theft to modern reclamation. Markets would prioritize local goods, funded by the nation's wealth. The military would train youth, not for war, but for protection of their own soil. "We're not just answering Langley," Traoré said. "We're answering history." The next morning, Traoré appeared at a community center in the heart of Wagadugu, not as a president, but as a citizen. He stood among teachers, farmers, and students, announcing a national initiative, Dignity Rising. It wasn't a policy or a slogan. It was a commitment to self-reliance, to education, to sovereignty. The crowd cheered, not with frenzy, but with resolve. A young girl handed Traoré a drawing of a mirror. It framed the colors of Burkina Faso's flag. He held it up, his voice quiet but firm. "This is our reflection. This is our future." The announcement rippled outward. In Accra, a news anchor called it a blueprint for a new Africa. In Nairobi, Beatrice, the podcast host, dedicated an episode to Dignity Rising, saying Traoré isn't just leading a nation. He's leading a mindset. In Washington, the news landed differently. Some dismissed it as propaganda, but others saw its power. A professor at Howard University tweeted, "Traoré's not playing their game. He's rewriting the rules." The American audience, especially those skeptical of institutional power, began to listen more closely. "He's doing what we talk about," a factory worker in Cleveland said at a union meeting. "Taking back what's theirs." Langley's silence, meanwhile, grew louder. Rumors swirled. Retirement, a private apology, a reassignment, but nothing materialized. In a rare moment, a junior senator from California broke ranks, speaking on a Sunday talk show. "If General Langley has evidence, he should show it," she said. "If not, he owes the world an explanation." The comment trended briefly, but Langley remained a ghost, his stars dimmed by his own refusal to speak. In Wagadugu, the absence of Langley's response was no longer the focus. Traoré had shifted the narrative, not by attacking, but by building. Schools began teaching the Dignity Rising curriculum, with lessons on Burkina Faso's history and resources. Markets buzzed with local traders, their stalls funded by government grants tied to the gold reserves. Young men and women lined up for community defense training, their faces proud. The world watched, and some began to follow. In Mali, a youth group launched a similar initiative. In Zimbabwe, a mayor adopted Traoré's model for local markets. The American audience, particularly those aged 35 to 65, found themselves reflecting. They valued hard work, fairness, and the idea that truth should prevail. Traoré's actions resonated with their belief in self-made success, even if his context was foreign. In a Chicago diner, a retired nurse said, "He's not waiting for permission. That's what I respect." In a Houston bar, a construction worker nodded at the TV. Langley's got all the medals, but Traoré's got the people. The divide persisted. Some saw Traoré as a threat, others as a hero, but the conversation had shifted. It wasn't about gold or Russia anymore. It was about who gets to define dignity. As weeks passed, Traoré's movement grew, not in volume, but in depth. In Wagadugu's Central Plaza, where the crowds had first gathered, a permanent mural was unveiled. It showed a mirror, its reflection holding Burkina Faso's flag, with Traoré's words etched below. "If you see a black man in power and choose to attack him for another's applause, look in the mirror and tell me who is still bound." The artist, a young woman named Fatou, stood before it, her voice steady. "This isn't the end," she said. "It's the beginning." Langley's fate remained unclear. Some said he'd been quietly sidelined, his testimony a misstep too public to recover from. Others believed he'd chosen silence, unable to reconcile the man he'd been with the role he'd played. In a rare interview, Clara, the retired journalist, wrote, "Langley's silence is his mirror. He'll have to face it someday." The Pentagon moved on, issuing new directives, but the general's name faded, a footnote in a story no longer his. Traoré, meanwhile, walked forward. He visited villages, shook hands with farmers, listened to students. He wasn't a savior or a saint, just a man who'd chosen to speak when silence was expected. In a quiet moment, standing by a river outside Wagadugu, he looked at his reflection in the water. Samuel, his aide, stood nearby. "Do you think they'll ever understand?" Samuel asked. Traoré smiled faintly. "It's not about them understanding. It's about us knowing." The story didn't end with a grand gesture or a final confrontation. It ended with a nation building, a people reclaiming a mirror held high. Across Burkina Faso, children carried notebooks with dignity rising stamped on the covers. In the diaspora, poets and organizers carried Traoré's words into their own fights. In America, the conversation continued, quieter now, but deeper, as people wrestled with what it meant to stand tall. And in Wagadugu, under a starlit sky, a young boy tied a ribbon to a fence, its colors bright against the night. He whispered, "This is our time." The wind carried the words, not as an echo, but as a promise.